She was fired for bringing her dying father to work, but she didn't stop. For 127 days, she kept bringing him in secret, and when he found out, he was overcome with shame. This is the story of how a housekeeper chose to disobey, and how that disobedience taught a wealthy tycoon what his money could never buy. If you've ever felt the world forcing you to choose between two impossible options, stay with us, because this story is going to break your heart, and then show you that sometimes rules are made to be broken. Richard Sterling had a very simple rule. His home was his sanctuary. No one entered without his permission. Nothing was out of place. Everything functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. At 52 years old, he had built a tech company worth $500 million. Absolute control, maximum efficiency, zero tolerance for chaos. His 8-bedroom mansion in Bel Air was a perfect reflection of his philosophy. Italian marble floors, minimalist designer furniture, not a single personal photograph on the walls. It looked more like a luxury hotel than a home, and that was exactly what he wanted. Divorced for 5 years, no children, a conscious decision. Children required time, time he didn't have, time his company needed. He lived alone. He preferred it that way, but someone had to maintain that perfection. And that's where Maria Rodriguez came in. Maria had worked for Richard for 3 years, 48 years old, a serene face, hands that never trembled no matter how heavy the task. She arrived at 7 in the morning, she left at 7 at night, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, never late, never asking for days off, never complaining. In 3 years, Richard knew practically nothing about her. He didn't know if she had children, he didn't know where she lived exactly. He didn't know what she liked to do on Sundays, and he didn't care. For him, Maria was perfect precisely because of that. She was invisible. She did her job impeccably, and then disappeared. She didn't invade his space with personal dramas. She didn't ask him for favors. She didn't tell him her problems. That invisibility was exactly what Richard paid for, $12,000 a month. A fair wage for a housekeeper in Los Angeles. Neither generous nor stingy. Exactly what the market dictated. But what Richard didn't know was that Maria carried a secret that weighed more than all the marble floors in that house. Her father was dying. Mr. Hector Rodriguez, 72 years old, multiple sclerosis, diagnosed 8 years ago. A disease that attacks the nervous system progressively, without pity, without a cure. For the first 5 years, Mr. Rodriguez had been able to walk with a cane. He could still dress himself. He could still eat without help. But the last 3 years had been a brutal decline. Now he was in a wheelchair. His hands trembled violently when he tried to hold something. He had difficulty speaking. The words came out slow and slurred. He needed help going to the bathroom, to bathe, to eat. And Maria was all he had. His wife had died 15 years ago from cancer. Maria was an only child, no siblings, no close aunts or uncles. There was no one else, just her. Mr. Rodriguez had been an aircraft mechanic for 40 years. He worked at Los Angeles International Airport, repairing commercial airplane engines. Steady hands that could adjust microscopic precision parts. Hands that never failed, until the MS took them away. Now those same hands trembled so much that he couldn't even hold a glass of water without spilling it, and every time he tried, Maria saw the shame in his eyes, the humiliation, the pain of a proud man reduced to dependence. Mr. Rodriguez lived in a small apartment in Echo Park, 2nd floor, no elevator, 500 square feet. Maria paid the rent, $4,500 a month, plus $2,000 for medications, plus $1,500 for special food, plus $1,000 for utilities. Of her $12,000 salary, she had $3,000 left for herself. She had tried to hire a caregiver. The cheapest one charged $15,000 a month, $3,000 more than she earned in total. Impossible. So Maria did the only thing she could. She worked from 7 in the morning to 7 at night at Richard's house, and then she rushed to her father's apartment. She fed him dinner, she bathed him, she gave him his medication, she put him to bed. She slept 4 hours, she got up at 5 in the morning, she prepared Mr. Rodriguez's breakfast, she left him with the neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Gladys, a 70-year-old woman who agreed to watch him during the day for $2,000 a month. A precarious arrangement, fragile. That worked only because both women were desperate. Mrs. Gladys needed the money. Maria needed someone to watch that her father didn't fall. And then one Tuesday in February, everything collapsed. Mrs. Gladys got sick, pneumonia, hospitalized. She couldn't take care of Mr. Rodriguez. Maria called 3 emergency caregiver agencies. All of them asked for at least $5,000 per day. She didn't have $5,000, so she made a decision that would change everything. She brought him to work. It was February 14th, 6:40 in the morning. Richard was still asleep. Maria entered through the service entrance, pushing Mr. Rodriguez's wheelchair. She set him up in the service room, a small room of 10 by 13 feet next to the kitchen, a single bed, a bathroom, a window that overlooked the garden. She gave him breakfast, she gave him his medication, she left him with a blanket, she told him not to make noise, and then she went out to work as if nothing had happened. For 6 hours, it worked perfectly. Maria cleaned the house every 2 hours. She went to the service room with the excuse of looking for cleaning products. She gave Mr. Rodriguez water. She asked him if he needed to go to the bathroom. Richard suspected nothing until at 2:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Rodriguez had a coughing fit. Richard was in his office on the 2nd floor, a video conference with investors from Singapore. He heard the cough, a deep, hoarse, desperate cough. He hung up the call. He went downstairs. He followed the sound to the service room. He opened the door without knocking, and he saw an old man in a wheelchair coughing violently, with Maria kneeling next to him, patting him on the back. Richard froze. His face went from confusion to disbelief, and then to fury. Maria stood up immediately. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Richard spoke in a voice so cold it seemed to freeze the air. "This is my house, not a nursing home. Who is he?" "My father, sir." "I'm sorry. The person taking care of him got sick, and she had nobody to leave him with, and I don't care, Maria. Listen to me very carefully. This is my house, my space. I pay you to clean and not to bring your family here. Understand?" "Yes, Mr. Sterling. If you bring him here again, you're fired. Is that clear?" Maria lowered her gaze and nodded. "I want you to leave. Now, take him with you and come back alone tomorrow. Or don't come back at all." Maria packed Mr. Rodriguez's things in silence. She put his jacket on him, pushed his wheelchair toward the service entrance. Mr. Rodriguez looked back. He saw Richard standing in the doorway of the utility room, arms crossed, face like stone, and with his trembling voice, slurring the words with difficulty. Mr. Rodriguez said something that Richard would never forget. "Sorry for existing." The door closed. Richard was left alone in his immaculate home. Everything was in order again. Absolute silence. Control restored. Exactly how he liked it. But for some reason, those 4 words kept resonating in his head. Sorry for existing. Maria returned the next day, alone. She arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. She worked in silence. Didn't mention what had happened. Richard didn't either. For 3 days, everything went back to normal. But on the 4th day, something changed. Richard noticed that Maria seemed more tired, dark circles under her eyes, slower movements. On the 5th day, he noticed that she arrived with her hair slightly damp, as if she had taken a shower in a hurry. On the 6th day, he found her asleep, sitting in a chair in the kitchen during her lunch hour, something that had never happened in 3 years. Richard didn't ask anything. It wasn't his problem. But there was something else. Every morning, when Richard got up at 7, Maria was already working. It had always been that way, but now there was something different. One day, Richard woke up at 6:30. He had an early call with Tokyo. He went down to the kitchen to make himself some coffee, and he heard a strange sound, a soft thump, like someone closing a door with extreme care. It was coming from the direction of the service entrance. Richard walked over there. He looked through the window that overlooked the back parking lot, and he saw Maria entering through the service door at 6:30 in the morning, half an hour before her scheduled time. Richard frowned. Why was she arriving so early? He didn't say anything. He went back to his office, but something in his brain, something small and insistent, told him that something wasn't right. During the following weeks, Richard started noticing more strange things. Food was disappearing from the refrigerator, not much, small portions, a banana, 2 slices of bread, a yogurt. When he asked, Maria said that she'd been hungrier lately. Richard accepted it, but then he noticed something else. The utility room door was always locked during the day. In 3 years, it had never been locked. When Richard asked why, Maria said that she was storing new cleaning supplies and didn't want them to get mixed up. Richard accepted it, but there was something more. One day, Richard went down to the kitchen at 6 in the morning for an urgent call. He passed by the utility room and he heard something, a voice, low, barely audible, but definitely a voice. Richard stopped. He pressed his ear to the door. "It's okay, Dad. It's almost time. Just a little more water." Richard's heart stopped. He pressed his ear harder. He heard a moan, the sound of someone coughing softly, the creak of a wheelchair, and then he understood. Maria hadn't obeyed. She had kept bringing her father, in secret, for weeks. Richard slowly walked away from the door. He went up to his office. He closed the door. He sat down at his desk, and a cold fury began to grow in his chest. She had disobeyed him, directly, intentionally, for weeks, maybe months. This woman had been bringing her father into his house without his permission, hiding him, lying to his face. Richard opened his laptop. He checked the security camera recordings from the back parking lot, and what he saw left him speechless. 127 days, 127 mornings. Maria arrived at 5:30, not at 7, at 5:30, pushing her father's wheelchair, entering through the service door, disappearing inside the house, and at 7, when Richard woke up, she was already working as if nothing was wrong. 127 days, almost 4 months, lying, disobeying, making a fool of him in his own house. Richard felt his jaw clench, his hands close into fists. He was going to fire her today, but a part of him, a small part that he barely recognized, asked him an uncomfortable question. If she had been doing this for 127 days, bringing her father at 5:30 in the morning, taking care of him in secret, and yet your house has been impeccable every single one of those days, every meal prepared perfectly, every floor shining like a mirror, every detail exactly as you like it. What does that say about her? Richard shook his head. It didn't matter. She had disobeyed. She had lied. Rules were rules. And he was going to confront her today. But something stopped him. Instead of going downstairs immediately, Richard waited. He observed for 2 more days. He watched in silence. And what he saw began to change something inside him. Something he didn't expect. Something that would deeply unsettle him. Because Maria Rodriguez wasn't just a housekeeper who disobeyed orders. She was someone who had found a way to do the impossible. And Richard was about to discover the price she had paid for those 127 days. If this story is making you uncomfortable, good, because what's coming is worse, because Richard is going to discover something that will shatter him, and he will realize that for 127 days, he was the villain of this story without knowing it. During the next 2 days, Richard did something he had never done in 3 years. He watched, really watched. Not his house, not whether the floors were clean or if his shirt was ironed. He watched Maria. On the first day, he woke up at 5:15 in the morning. He set a silent alarm. He got dressed in the dark. He went downstairs without making a sound. He hid in the living room, behind the curtains that overlooked the back parking lot, and he waited. At 5:32 in the morning, an old taxi pulled up in front of the service entrance. Maria got out first. She opened the back door. She took out the folded wheelchair. She unfolded it with quick, precise movements that spoke of months of practice. Then she helped Mr. Rodriguez out of the taxi. The old man moved with painful slowness. His legs barely responded. Sophia held him with one hand under his arm, the other on his back. She gently lowered him into the wheelchair, a tenderness that stirred something uncomfortably in Richard's chest. She paid the cab driver, waited for him to leave, and then pushed the wheelchair towards the service entrance. She unlocked the door with a key, stepped inside, quietly shut the door behind her. Richard checked his watch. 5:38 a.m. He didn't move from his hiding spot. Waited 15 minutes. Then he crept toward the housekeeper's quarters. The door was closed but not locked. There was a small crack. Richard hated himself for what he was doing, but he couldn't stop. He peered through the crack, and what he saw left him frozen. Maria was kneeling in front of Mr. Hector. She held a bowl of oatmeal in one hand, a spoon in the other. She fed him slowly, patiently waiting each time the old man struggled to swallow. But it wasn't just that. As she fed him, Maria spoke to him. "It's Tuesday, Dad, May 28th. It's sunny outside. You look like you slept well. You look better. Do you remember you have to take the blue pill at 8 today? I have it ready. Look, I brought the newspaper. After you eat, I'll read you the sports section. I know you like that." Mr. Hector didn't respond. He only looked at his daughter with watery eyes. Maria finished feeding him breakfast. She wiped his mouth with a napkin, gave him a glass of water with a straw, holding the glass because Mr. Hector's hands shook too much. Then she stood up, checked her watch. 6:10. "I have to start work soon. You'll be all right here, won't you? I have the baby monitor here. If you need anything, just say my name and I'll come. No one asks me why I have the monitor anymore. They think it's to hear if there are problems in the house." Maria took a baby monitor from her bag, placed it on the small table next to Mr. Hector. The other monitor she tucked into her apron. Richard didn't know what to feel. This woman had transformed the housekeeper's quarters into a care room. She had brought a baby monitor to watch over her father while she worked. She had memorized his medication schedule. She spoke to him as if he could understand everything, with respect, with dignity, all while keeping him hidden in Richard's house. Mr. Hector raised his trembling hand, touched Maria's hand, and with his voice, dragging each word with monumental effort, he said something that pierced Richard's chest like a bullet. "You are my angel." Maria knelt down, kissed her father's forehead, and Richard saw something he hadn't seen in 3 years. Maria was crying, silently, without sobs, only tears streaming down her face as she held her father's trembling hand. "I'm not an angel, Dad. I'm just your daughter, and I'm going to take care of you until the end, no matter what." Richard backed away from the door slowly, went up to his room, sat on the edge of his bed, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to do. The next day, Richard observed again, this time during the day. At 9 in the morning, while Maria cleaned the living room, Richard saw that she carried a baby monitor in her apron pocket. Every 10 minutes, she checked it discreetly. At 11, Maria went to the kitchen with the excuse of preparing lunch. Richard followed her discreetly. He saw her chopping vegetables quickly, but he also saw that she was preparing 2 plates, one large, another smaller with soft, easy-to-swallow food. When Richard left the kitchen, Maria took the small plate to the housekeeper's quarters. She returned 15 minutes later. At 1 in the afternoon, Maria appeared with a laundry basket. Richard only had 3 shirts and 2 pairs of pants. The basket was half full, but Richard knew there was more clothing in there, clothing that wasn't his. At 3 in the afternoon, while Maria was cleaning the second-floor windows, Richard heard a sound from the baby monitor in her pocket. A moan. Maria dropped everything immediately, ran down the stairs, entered the housekeeper's quarters. Richard waited 5 minutes, went downstairs quietly, looked through the crack in the door. Maria was helping Mr. Hector go to the bathroom. The old man had wet himself. He was crying in shame. Sorry, sorry, sorry. Maria held him firmly, but with infinite gentleness. It's okay, Dad. It's okay. It's normal. It's all right now. Let's get you cleaned up. Relax. She led him to the bathroom, closed the door. Richard heard the water running, heard Maria speaking to him softly, reassuring him. 20 minutes later, Maria came out with Mr. Hector clean, in different clothes, back in his chair. And then Maria went back upstairs and continued cleaning the windows as if nothing had happened. Richard stood in the hallway, and something inside him began to break. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about what he had seen, and then he remembered something. The notebook. He had seen a blue notebook in the housekeeper's quarters when he looked through the crack. At 2 in the morning, Richard went downstairs quietly, entered the housekeeper's quarters. Mr. Hector was asleep in the small bed, breathing heavily. Richard saw the notebook on the table. He opened it, and what he read destroyed him. Day 1, February 14th. Today, I brought Dad for the first time. Mrs. Gladys is sick. I have no choice. Mr. Sterling will fire me if he finds out. But Dad can't be alone. He's scared. I am too. Day 2, February 15th. Mr. Sterling discovered Dad. He ordered me never to bring him again. Dad apologized for existing. I cried all night. Tomorrow I go back alone. I don't know what to do with Dad. Day 3, February 16th. I left Dad alone in the apartment. When I returned at 7 in the evening, I found him on the floor. He had fallen. He had a bump on his head. He cried, saying he didn't want to be a burden. I promised him I would find a solution. Day 4, February 17th. I've made a decision. I'll bring him again, in secret. Mr. Sterling gets up at 7. I'll arrive at 5:30. Dad will be in the housekeeper's quarters. I'll work normally. No one has to know. It's the only way. Day 5, February 18th. It worked. I arrived at 5:30. I settled Dad in. At 7, I started working. Mr. Sterling didn't suspect anything. Dad behaved very well. He didn't make a noise. I told him this is temporary. I lied. Richard flipped through the pages quickly. Every day Maria had written an entry. 127 days of entries. Day 23, March 8th. Dad had a coughing fit. I thought Mr. Sterling would hear him. My hands were shaking, but he was in a video conference with headphones. He didn't hear. Day 45, March 30th. I'm sleeping 3 hours a night. I get up at 4 in the morning to prepare Dad. We got here at 5:30 a.m. I work until 7 p.m. I take Dad back, I bathe him, I feed him dinner, I go to bed at 1 a.m. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Day 67, April 21st. I fell asleep cleaning the kitchen today. Mr. Sterling woke me up. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. I lied, I'm exhausted, but I can't stop. Dad needs me. Day 89, May 13th. Dad almost called me when Mr. Sterling was nearby. I gently covered his mouth. I begged him not to make a sound. He cried. I cried too. This can't go on like this, but I have no other choice. Day 103, May 27th. I bought a baby monitor. Now I can hear if Dad needs me while I'm working. I told Mr. Sterling it's to listen for any strange noises in the house. He believed me. Day 127, June 20th. Today, Mr. Sterling came downstairs early. He heard my voice in the utility room. I think he suspects something. I don't know what to do. If he fires me, I don't know how I'll pay Dad's rent. I don't know how I'll pay for his medications. Please, God, help me. Richard closed the notebook. His hands were trembling. He went back to his room, sat on his bed, and covered his face with his hands. 127 days. 127 days that woman had lived in terror of being discovered. 127 days she had slept 3 hours a night. 127 days she had cared for her dying father in secret while keeping Richard's house absolutely spotless, and he had almost fired her. He had threatened her. He had made a dying old man apologize for existing. Richard didn't cry. Men like him didn't cry. Men like him controlled their emotions with surgical precision. But that night, something inside Richard Sterling broke, and for the first time in decades, he couldn't control anything. The next day, Richard did something more. Instead of confronting Maria, he decided to observe once more. He needed to understand something that made no sense to him. How was it possible for someone to work perfectly under so much pressure? At 5:30 in the morning, Richard was awake. He watched from the window as Maria arrived with Mr. Hector. The usual routine, quick, efficient, silent. But this time, Richard kept watching from different angles, all day, and he began to notice details that shattered him. At 7:15, Maria was cleaning the dining room. Richard saw that her hands were trembling slightly from exhaustion, but she kept working. At 9 o'clock, while mopping the floor, Maria stopped for a second, closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then continued. At 11, Richard saw her preparing lunch. She was chopping vegetables mechanically, with movements that spoke of utter exhaustion, but every cut was perfect. At 2 in the afternoon, while folding laundry, Maria sat down on a chair for 30 seconds, just 30 seconds. Then she stood up and continued. Richard had never noticed these pauses before, because they lasted so little time that they were invisible. But now that he was really watching, he saw them all, and each one was like a dagger in his chest. At 4 in the afternoon, Richard decided to do something he had never done. He spoke to Maria, not to fire her, just to talk. "Maria, can you come here for a moment?" Maria arrived immediately, serene face, hands clasped. "Yes, sir?" "Sit down, please." Maria hesitated. Housekeepers didn't sit down in front of their employers, but Richard insisted. "Please." Maria sat down, straight back, hands in her lap. Richard didn't know how to start, so he asked something simple. "How long have you worked for me?" 3 years and 4 months, sir." "And in all that time, have you ever been late?" "No, sir." "Have you ever asked for a day off?" "Only last year's Day of the Dead, sir, to visit my mother's grave." Richard nodded slowly. "Why do you work so hard, Maria?" Maria looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, Richard saw something in her eyes. Weariness, pain, desperation, but also determination. "Because it's my job, sir, and because I need the money." "For what?" Maria lowered her gaze. "To take care of my father." Richard felt his throat tighten. "Your father? The one you brought here a few months ago?" "Yes, sir. I apologize again for that." "It won't happen again." Maria lied when she said that, and they both knew it. But Richard said nothing. "What does your father have?" "Multiple sclerosis, sir. He's in a wheelchair. He needs constant care. And there's no one else who can take care of him?" Maria shook her head. "My mother died 15 years ago. I'm an only child. It's just him and me." "What about a professional caregiver?" Maria smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a broken smile. "It costs $15,000 a month, sir. I earn $12,000. Richard felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "I see. You can go back to your work." Maria stood up, gave a small bow, and left the room. And Richard was left alone with a question he couldn't ignore. What would I do if I were in her place? If you had to choose between your job and taking care of the only person you love in the world, what would you do? And don't give me any easy answers. Don't tell me you'd look for another solution, because Maria had already looked for every solution, and none of them worked. The numbers didn't add up. The reality was brutal. The choice was impossible. So what would you do? Would you obey an order that means condemning your father to die alone? Or would you disobey and risk everything? Don't lie, because deep down, you already know the answer. You would do exactly what Maria did. That afternoon, Richard did something he never thought he would do. He went to the utility room at 6 in the evening when Maria was getting ready to take Mr. Hector back. He knocked on the door. He waited. Maria opened it. Her face paled. "Sir, may I come in?" It wasn't a question. Maria stepped aside. Richard entered. He saw Mr. Hector in his wheelchair with a blanket over his legs. A hand-knitted blanket, blue and white, with the name Hector embroidered in one corner. Richard looked at the blanket. Then he looked at Maria. "Who made this?" Maria hesitated. "I did, sir. At night, after putting my father to bed. I can't sleep much anyway, so I knit." Richard felt something break in his chest. "How long did it take you?" 3 months, sir." Richard knelt down in front of Mr. Hector. The old man looked at him with frightened eyes. "Mr. Hector, my name is Richard. This is my home, and I need to apologize." Mr. Hector blinked, confused. "For what?" "For making you feel like you had to apologize for existing. No one should feel that way. And I was wrong." Richard stood up. He looked at Maria. "Tomorrow, you don't have to bring him in secret." Maria froze. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Sir, tomorrow, bring your father, but don't hide him. No more secrets." "But you said—" "I know what I said, and I was wrong." Richard left the housekeeper's quarters, and behind him, he heard something that would keep him awake that night. Maria, crying. For the first time in 127 days, crying with relief. But what Richard didn't know was that the story was far from over, because the next day, when Maria arrived with Mr. Hector at 7 in the morning instead of 5:30, Richard was going to discover something that would change everything. Something that would embarrass him in a way he didn't think possible. Something that would make him cry for the first time in 20 years. The next day, Richard woke up at 6:30. He went downstairs, made coffee, and waited. At 7 o'clock sharp, he heard the service door open. Maria walked in, pushing Mr. Hector's wheelchair. But this time she didn't hide. This time she walked straight into the kitchen, where Richard was standing. Maria stopped in the doorway. She paled at seeing him there. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Maria." "Mr. Rodriguez." Richard stood up. He walked towards Mr. Hector. He knelt down in front of him. "Mr. Rodriguez, this house has 8 bedrooms. 7 are empty. I would like one of them to be yours." Maria let out a sob. Mr. Hector looked at Richard, with tears in his eyes. Richard continued, "You don't have to be in the housekeeper's quarters anymore. You don't have to hide anymore. You don't have to apologize for existing. This is your home too." Maria knelt down. She hugged her father. They were both crying, and Richard realized something that deeply embarrassed him. In 3 years, he had never seen Maria as a complete human being, only as a housekeeper. He had never asked about her family, about her fears, about her dreams. He had never seen that behind that invisible woman. There was a daughter who was sacrificing everything for her father, and that shame was going to change him forever. That same morning, Richard did something Maria didn't expect. He called an architect. He asked him to adapt one of the rooms on the first floor for a person in a wheelchair, accessible bathroom, ramps, handrails. 2 weeks, said the architect. Richard replied, "You have 1 week. Meanwhile, Mr. Hector could stay in the housekeeper's quarters, but no longer hidden, no longer in secret. During the following days, Richard began to notice things he had never seen. He noticed that Maria arrived at 7, not 5:30, and seemed less tired. He noticed that Mr. Hector, when he wasn't terrified of being discovered, was actually a sweet and polite man. He noticed that when Maria fed her father, she sang him songs softly. old songs from the 60s, and he noticed that Mr. Hector, despite his trembling hands, despite his difficulty speaking, smiled. Richard started doing something strange. Every morning, before going up to his office, he would stop by the housekeeper's quarters and greet Mr. Hector. "Good morning, Mr. Rodriguez. How did you sleep?" Mr. Hector looked at him with surprise every time, as if he couldn't believe that the millionaire who had kicked him out was now asking him how he had slept. "Fine, thank you." At first, the conversations were short. Richard didn't know what to say. Mr. Hector didn't either, but little by little, they started talking more. One day, Richard asked him what he had done for a living, and Mr. Hector, with his slow and labored voice, told him about his career as an aviation mechanic. 40 years, repairing engines. Richard sat down, and for the first time, he listened, really listened. Mr. Hector told him about the planes he had repaired, the Boeing 737s, the Airbus A320s, the old DC-9s. He told him about the time he detected a critical failure in an engine that the computerized systems had overlooked. He saved 200 lives that day. He told him about the pride he felt when a plane he had repaired took off perfectly, and as he spoke, his eyes shone, as if for a moment, the multiple sclerosis disappeared, and he was once again the mechanic with steady hands he had been. Richard left that conversation in silence, and he realized something devastating. He had reduced that man to a problem, to an inconvenience, to something that had to be hidden. But Mr. Hector was not a problem. He was a hero, a father, a man who had worked 40 years with dignity, and Richard had treated him like trash. A week later, the room was ready. Richard showed it to Maria and Mr. Hector personally. They had converted one of the rooms on the first floor into a completely accessible space. Bathroom with safety bars, shower with a chair, adjustable bed, a large window overlooking the garden, and on the door, Richard had a small plaque put up. Hector Rodriguez, aviation engineer. When Mr. Hector saw the plaque, he started to cry. Maria too, and Richard had to leave the room because he didn't trust that his voice wouldn't break. That night, Richard did something else. He called Maria to his office. "Maria, your current salary is $12,000 a month." "Yes, sir." "That's going to change. Starting tomorrow, your salary will be $36,000 a month." Maria was speechless. "Sir, it's not a favor. It's only fair. You've been doing the work of 3 people, taking care of your father, maintaining this house, and sacrificing your health. It's the least I can do." Maria started to cry, but Richard wasn't finished. "And your schedule is going to change too. From 7 in the morning to 1 in the afternoon. 6 hours, not 12. You need time to take care of your father, and to take care of yourself." Maria covered her face with her hands. "And one more thing. I'm going to hire a physical therapist for Mr. Hector. 3 times a week. I'll pay for it. It's non-negotiable." Maria knelt down in front of Richard. "Mr. Sterling, I don't know what to say. Richard helped her to her feet. "Don't thank me, Maria. I should be apologizing to you. For 127 days, you had to live in fear in this house. That should never have happened. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time you work here trying to make up for it." Maria left the office crying, and Richard was left alone, looking out the window. For the first time in years, his house felt less empty. If you're listening to this story and feel a lump in your throat, wait, because what's coming now is the part that's going to break you. Because Richard is going to discover the true cost of those 127 days, and he'll understand that some people don't disobey out of rebellion. They disobey out of love. The next 3 months were the strangest of Richard Sterling's life. His house, which had always been as silent as a museum, now had life. Every morning, he'd hear Maria talking to Mr. Hector as she served him breakfast. "It's Wednesday today, Dad. It's chilly. I saw that the physical therapist left you some new exercises. We'll do them after breakfast, every afternoon. He'd hear the physical therapist working with Mr. Hector, exercises for his hands, for his legs, to maintain what little mobility he had left. And every night, before Maria left, he'd hear her reading the newspaper to her father. The sports section, always the sports section. Richard started coming downstairs more often, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes to chat. Mr. Hector was more talkative now. His dignity had given him back some life. One day, Richard brought him something, a book, The History of Commercial Aviation in the United States, with photos of old planes, models that Mr. Hector might have repaired back in the day. Mr. Hector opened the book with his trembling hands. He turned the pages slowly, and when he got to the picture of a DC-9, his eyes lit up. I repaired this model. 1983. Richard sat next to him and listened. Mr. Hector told him stories of his life, of his wife who had passed away, of how he met Maria's mother at a Christmas party at the airport, of how Maria had been born prematurely and he had prayed all night in the waiting room of the hospital, of how when Maria turned 15, he gave her a plane ride as a gift, the first time she'd ever been on a passenger plane, and how she had cried with emotion. Richard listened to everything, and with each story, the weight on his chest grew heavier, because this man wasn't a problem. He was a whole life, a story, a father who loved his daughter more than his own dignity. One day, Richard came home early. It was 11 in the morning. He walked in through the front door, and he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. It was coming from Mr. Hector's room. Richard walked silently towards it. He peeked through the slightly open door. Maria was sitting next to her father. She had a photo album in her hands. She was showing the photos to Mr. Hector, describing each one because he couldn't hold the album himself. "Look, Dad, this is from my graduation day. Remember, I cried because I didn't think you were going to make it, but you came, even in your airport uniform." Mr. Hector smiled, and with his labored voice, he said something that made Richard freeze. "You are my pride." Maria kissed her father's forehead. "And you're my hero, Dad." Richard walked away in silence. He went up to his office, closed the door, and for the first time in 20 years, Richard Sterling wept. He didn't cry because the scene was sad. He cried because it was beautiful. He cried because for 127 days, that beauty had existed in his house in secret, in a converted maid's quarters, hidden, terrified of being discovered. He cried because he had been the reason for that terror. He cried because he realized that he had spent 52 years of his life chasing control, efficiency, perfection, and he had completely lost sight of what it meant to be human. When Maria knocked on his door an hour later to tell him that lunch was ready, Richard's eyes were red. "Are you all right, Mr. Sterling?" Richard nodded. "I'm fine, Maria. Just thinking." Maria turned to leave. "Maria, wait." She stopped. "I want you to know something. What you did. Bringing your father here for 127 days, caring for him in secret, working perfectly despite everything. It wasn't disobedience. It was love. And I should have seen that from the beginning." Maria smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. That means a lot." When she left, Richard stood staring out the window, and he made a decision. He was going to change, not just with Maria and Mr. Hector, with everything. The next day, Richard did something that his management team never expected. He called a company-wide meeting, 300 employees, and he announced something that left everyone in shock. "Starting today, our company will have a new benefit. It will be called the Corporate Caregivers Program. Any employee who has a family member with a chronic illness or disability will receive 12 weeks of paid leave per year. In addition, the company will subsidize up to $10,000 a month to hire professional caregivers." The silence in the room was absolute. I know this is unusual. I know it will affect our margins, but I've learned something recently. People aren't machines. They have families, they have responsibilities, they have loves. And if we want them to work well, we have to allow them to be human first. 50 employees used the program in the first year. 50 families who no longer had to choose between their job and caring for the ones they loved, and all because Richard had seen a woman kneeling in a converted maid's quarters, feeding her father with infinite patience. 3 months after Mr. Hector moved permanently into the adapted room, something extraordinary happened. The physical therapist arrived for the routine session. After an hour of work, he called Richard and Maria. "I need to show you something." They entered the room. Mr. Hector was sitting in his wheelchair with the physical therapist standing next to him. "Mr. Hector, can you try what we practiced?" Mr. Hector nodded, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and slowly, very slowly, he raised his right hand. It wasn't much, maybe 6 inches. The hand was still trembling violently, but he raised it. For the first time in 3 years, he raised his hand without help. Maria covered her mouth with her hands. Mr. Hector kept his hand raised for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then he lowered it, exhausted, and with his labored voice, he looked at Richard and said something that none of those present would ever forget. "Thank you for letting me live." Richard had to leave the room. He didn't want anyone to see him cry. Again, that night, Richard sat in his office, opened his laptop, and wrote something in his personal journal, something he had never written before. "For 52 years, I chased control. I built an empire. I made millions. I had everything the world says you must have to be successful. But I was living in an expensive tomb, a house without life, a heart without purpose." Maria Rodriguez, a housekeeper who earns a fraction of what I do, taught me more about humanity in 127 days than I learned in my entire life. He taught me that disobedience can be love, that rules are sometimes meant to be broken, that there are things more important than control, and that a man in a wheelchair who can't hold a glass of water has more dignity in his trembling pinky finger than I have in my entire body. Today, Mr. Hector Rodriguez raised his hand, 6 inches, 6 inches that for him were like scaling Mount Everest, and I wept. Because I realized that miracles don't come in the form of complete cures. They come in the form of 6 inches, of a smile, of a man saying, "Thank you for letting me live." If I could go back to February 14th, when I found Mr. Hector coughing in my servants' quarters, I would do everything differently. I wouldn't fire him. I'd apologize for not inviting him sooner. But I can't go back. I can only move forward and honor what Maria Rodriguez taught me. That a house without humanity is not a home. It's a tomb, and I no longer want to live in a tomb. Richard Sterling closed his laptop. He looked out the window toward the garden, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Because his house finally had what it had always lacked: life. 6 months after the day Mr. Hector Rodriguez first raised his hand, something even more extraordinary happened. Richard came downstairs one morning and found Mr. Hector sitting in his wheelchair in the garden. Maria was beside him, reading him the newspaper, but there was something different. Mr. Hector had something in his hand, a pencil and a piece of paper. Richard approached slowly. "Mr. Hector, what are you doing?" Mr. Hector looked up. He smiled, and with his labored voice, said, "Writing my name." Richard looked at the paper, and what he saw left him speechless. On the paper, in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, but unmistakably there, were 2 words: Hector Rodriguez. The first time in 3 years that Mr. Hector had written his own name, Maria had tears in her eyes. "We started practicing 2 months ago. The physical therapist said it was impossible, but Dad didn't give up." Richard knelt in front of Mr. Hector. "Mr. Hector, "Do you know what this means?" Mr. Hector nodded slowly. "It means that I still exist." Richard felt his throat tighten. "You always existed, Mr. Hector, always." That night, Richard did something that none of them expected. He framed the paper with Mr. Hector's name, and he hung it on the wall of the living room, next to a painting that had cost $50,000. When Maria saw it the next day, she was speechless. "Mr. Sterling, that paper it's the most valuable thing in this house, Maria. It's proof that the impossible can be broken. And I want everyone who enters here to see it. Some people don't need gold trophies to be champions. They just need a pencil, a piece of paper, and someone who never stops believing in them." A year after Mr. Hector moved into Richard's house, everyone's life had changed. Mr. Hector no longer just raised his hand. He could hold light objects for a few seconds. He could write short words. His tremors had reduced by 30%. The doctors couldn't explain it. But Richard and Maria could. Dignity, love, purpose. Those three things had done more for Mr. Hector than any medication. Maria no longer worked 12 hours a day. She worked 6. The rest of the time she spent with her father, reading, talking, laughing, and for the first time in years, she slept 8 hours a night. Her salary had gone from $12,000 to $36,000. She had paid off all her debts. She had saved money for the first time in her life. She had been able to take Mr. Hector to a private neurologist who designed a personalized treatment plan. But most importantly, she had recovered something she thought she had lost forever: hope. And Richard, well, Richard was no longer the same man. His house was no longer a museum. It was a home. He had dinner with Maria and Mr. Hector 3 times a week. They talked. They laughed. Richard told them about his day. Mr. Hector told him stories about aviation. Maria shared memories of her childhood. Richard had reduced his work hours from 14 hours a day to 10, then to 8. He no longer worked weekends. His company didn't collapse. In fact, productivity increased. Because when the employees learned that their boss valued humanity over efficiency, they began to work with more purpose. The corporate caregiver program became a national model. Other companies began to copy it. Richard was invited to give lectures on leadership with empathy, but he knew the truth. He wasn't a visionary leader. He was a man who had needed a housekeeper to teach him what it meant to be human. 2 years after the day, Richard discovered Maria secretly caring for her father. Something final happened. Mr. Hector turned 75 years old. Richard threw a party. Not something big, not something ostentatious, just something simple, in the garden of the house. With balloons, with cake, with music from the 60s that Mr. Hector liked. They invited the physical therapist, Mrs. Gladys, the neighbor who had cared for Mr. Hector before, 3 of Richard's co-workers who had become friends with Mr. Hector. When they brought out the cake, Mr. Hector tried to blow out the candles. He couldn't do it alone. His lungs weren't strong enough. So Maria leaned in, and they blew together. The candles went out, and Mr. Hector, with tears in his eyes, said something that no one would forget. "This is the best birthday of my life." Richard looked around. He saw Maria hugging her father. He saw Mrs. Gladys wiping away tears. He saw the physical therapist smiling, and he realized something. This was the life he had been searching for 52 years. It wasn't in executive offices. It wasn't in bank accounts. It wasn't in empty 8-bedroom houses. It was here, in a garden, with a cake, with an old man in a wheelchair who had learned to blow out candles again, with a woman who had disobeyed for love, and with a millionaire who had learned that controlling everything means losing everything that matters. This story doesn't have a perfect ending, because real life isn't like that. Mr. Hector never fully recovered. Multiple sclerosis is degenerative, but it stopped getting worse. And that, for them, was a miracle. Maria never stopped being a housekeeper, but she was no longer invisible. She was family. And Richard never stopped being a millionaire, but he stopped being an empty man. 3 years later, when a journalist asked Richard what the best business decision of his life had been, his answer surprised everyone. It wasn't an acquisition at all. It wasn't a market strategy. It was when I stopped seeing people as resources and started seeing them as humans. It was when a housekeeper taught me that blind obedience isn't a virtue, that sometimes the most important rules are the ones you break for love. The journalist asked which housekeeper he was talking about. Richard smiled, softly. The one who saved my life by disobeying my orders. Today, if you visit Richard Sterling's house, you'll see something unusual. On the main wall of the living room, next to works of art that cost more than a car, there's a framed piece of paper. On that paper, in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, 2 words are written, Hector Rodriguez, and below, a small plaque that reads, "Proof that the impossible are just invitations to disobey what the world says can't be done." If this story broke your heart, good, because there are thousands of Marias in the world right now. People who have to choose between their job and caring for someone they love. People who sleep 3 hours a night. People who carry invisible burdens while the world demands perfection. And there are thousands of Richards too. People who have so much control that they've lost their humanity. People who live in empty houses. People who confuse success with life. The question is, which one are you? And more importantly, what are you going to do about it? You have 2 options now. You can forget this story, get on with your day, pretend it didn't affect you, or you can remember that small gestures save lives, that asking someone how they are doing can change everything, that behind every invisible person, there's a story that deserves to be seen. Richard Sterling was a millionaire, a tycoon who had everything and nothing. Maria Rodriguez was a housekeeper who had nothing and everything. And Mr. Hector Rodriguez was a man who learned that existing doesn't require anyone's permission. This story began with 127 days of secrets and ended with a truth that no one can hide, that love doesn't obey, that humanity isn't negotiable, and that sometimes heroes wear housekeeper uniforms. What story from your own life have you never told because you think no one would value it? What rule have you broken for love? What invisible person in your life deserves to be seen? Don't answer now. Just think about it, because maybe, just maybe, you too have 127 days of something waiting to be released. And maybe, just maybe, someone is waiting for you to be their Richard, or their Maria, or their Mr. Hector, who refuses to stop existing. This story has ended, but yours continues. What are you going to do with it?